Movie Time is produced by John DeSando. Listen to shows and read reviews online at WCBE.org.
I'm John DeSando.
And I'm Mary Yerina.
And this is Movie Time. Well, digging up a parking lot? Is that what we have descended to, Mary?
It is, but I view it as we've ascended to because we are looking for the lost king.
Ah, well, there's so many of those, this might be a very singular one, I would guess.
Yes, it is. If you've read anything in the news about Richard III in the last 10 years, you probably know that his body was discovered under a car park in Leicester, England. And this is the story behind that, focusing on the woman who probably should have been given due credit from the beginning, but was not, Philippa Langley.
Yeah, apparently later on she was included in all the panels and all the discussion. But this is as much an archaeological, partly piece of fiction, that I think is delightful in that Brit way.
Very true.
Yeah. And to me it also speaks an awful lot about research and about snobbery.
Especially in academia and the politics of academia and respecting or not respecting those who haven't come up through the system of academia. And then really the fight for the fame and glory when something proves to be right.
Yes, yeah, yes, true. There really are two parts of this. One is that the inspiration that she had, played by Sally Hawkins, who's really one of my favorite British actresses.
She really is wonderful in everything she does.
Oh my gosh. She was in Happy Go Lucky, which I saw years ago, and I thought she should have been nominated for an Oscar for that.
Well, and one of the first films you asked me to review was The Shape of Water.
Oh boy, that was a winner.
Also starring Sally Hawkins.
That was for sure. Both times playing something of an eccentric.
Well, in that case, she was a mute. In this case, in playing Philippa, Philippa Langley has been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. And that plays a role in her ability to work and her ability to manage her family, and also her having to pace herself for becoming inspired by and fascinated by the story of Richard III, and really taking it upon herself to put the pieces together as to where his body and burial site, which has been lost for over 500 years, really is.
Do you think, this is just, we made kind of a side question for my friend here, but did it feel a little bit hokey, the R on the macadam there?
You know, it did, but if you looked at real footage, it actually was there.
There's a big R emblem, which
is on the pavement of the car park.
I know.
And it's kind of, the attendant thinks it means reserved.
Right, yeah.
But it's in a really odd place.
Yes.
It's not in a painted spot.
Yeah, and it has that kind of Gothic or whatever it is lettering. It's just Mary. The minute I saw that, I said, this can't be real.
When you look at the real footage, it actually is. And the other thing that was a little, we're not giving anything away. They do find the body.
Yes, we all know that. Yes, right.
But the thing that, the timeline is never really discerned in the film, but in reality, her instincts told her that that's where they needed to look. And within hours of digging their first trench, they found the body. Now they started to undig it, and it showed signs that it probably was Richard III. But in archaeology, if there's any archaeologists out there, my impression is that you don't make discoveries like that within hours of digging your first trench. But in this case, they did.
You know, you bring up two things that really of interest me in this. First of all, what they found was so clearly, perhaps Richard, the scoliosis, and which I don't know if Shakespeare is responsible for making him a hunchback. There seems to be some question about that. But clearly he has a curvature of the spine. And then a gash in his head, which would have been from the Battle of Bosworth.
Right.
And I mean, again, your archaeologist friends here would say, whoa, boy, is that lucky.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't even have to do a DNA to have an idea that that's probably, yes, they do that, but that's probably Richard.
Yeah.
It's so strange to see it the way they illustrated it, cuddled almost like in a fetal position.
Well, yeah, and they discussed that he wasn't buried. There was question at the time of his death whether he was the legitimate king, but
Yes.
he's viewed as the last Plantagenet king. So he wasn't, because he lost in battle, he wasn't buried in regal ceremony in terms of a casket and his body being handled differently than it was. So the fact that it's kind of mashed up and deformed after 500 years of laying open in the earth, isn't surprising. And in fact, we learn in the movie that the feet of the skeleton were actually cut off, probably due to digging a sewer trench, where they were just trenching and had no idea that Richard III's body was buried there.
It was thought that he was thrown into the river. His body was thrown into the river.
There were certain legends of that happening, sure.
Yeah, and we're talking 500 years ago. And I remember the comment in the film, which was very interesting to me, that Shakespeare, who's the culprit here, or the one who cemented in our memories this demented king, and all about him that people question. But it had occurred 100 years before him, which in the film they feel like that's just millennia before, and it's only 100 years.
Well, it's 100 years, but it's 100 years during a time where there's not social media and immediate images and knowledge of something happening elsewhere in the world. So the fact that it's 100 years later, you have to wonder how much source material there really was for Shakespeare to draw from that was verified.
Sally Hawkins' portrayal of Philippa, I thought very interesting, because she is, despite the fact that she has this chronic disease, and she's downplayed by most of the men in her life. I mean, her husband supports her, played by Steve Coogan, in a sense, but not. You can't really believe it until you see the bones. I thought that she played it well because she wasn't crazed, although she was obsessive. There's something about it that was level, given the forces which she had to contend to do this.
And I thought a device that helped with that very sympathetic portrayal in the film was Philippa's thoughts and conversations within her mind about Richard and where is he, actually are manifested dramatically in the film as Richard III actually being kind of an imaginary companion to her on this journey, and her having the conversations that are in her head actually outside in talking to Richard, who's kind of her Harvey, if you will. To me, it was very sweet, very effective. The conversations have some humor in them, Philippa in real life actually talked about her inspiration and just having a gut feeling, and it's manifested in actually physically seeing Richard as her muse and inspiration, and that's her gut feeling that she's on the right track, and she refuses to be denied because she feels so strongly that she's right, that she knows he's there.
There's always be some criticism about the magical realism part of this, when he appearing on a white horse or appearing next to her on the bench and talking in these beautiful robes and this gold crown, and he's much better looking than the illustrated Richard.
I didn't have a problem with that.
I know, right? So it was a nice touch because it lets you know that this was fantastical, and because they sometimes have somebody else's point of view looking at her talking on the bench to appears to herself.
Right.
So you got the idea really quickly that this was just a fantasy, though some realists will object to that. But I think you did a great job of showing how that explains her passion for it.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah. Which she gets, and this is the same guy who played Richard in the theater production that inspired him.
That you see earlier in the film.
Yeah,
Yes.
nice touch. And I thought he did a nice job with Richard, which is
did.
often overplayed.
And Harry Lloyd is actually
Yes.
somebody people will recognize who plays Richard III. He actually was in Game of Thrones and other productions.
Okay.
But certainly that's probably one of his most famous, most recognizable roles. So he's played that period and that genre before, and he does a nice job here.
Yeah, this is not a feminist film in the formal sense. Although underneath it there's a current of feminism concerning her interrelationship with the men in the story. And I was so happy to see, though I couldn't get her name, the lady who's the head of the council.
Yes, the city council of Leicester believes in her.
Yes.
And because she has to get funding and she has to get permits in order to dig up a public car park in the middle of Leicester. And she did have a champion in the head of the council, which was refreshing. And this, I would disagree with you that it's not a feminist film. I think it is, in terms of, this is a woman who believed in what she knew and believed in her research and found a way through the maze of bureaucracy and academia to do it, and found her own voice and found her belief in herself that she could do this no matter how crazy it may seem to others or how many roadblocks she had in the way. And so it's a woman really finding her own agency in the face of these large bureaucratic institutions, not unlike the film Philomena, which also had the same creative team of director Stephen Frears, co-writers Jeff Pope and Steve Coogan, and Steve Coogan actually acting in front of the camera.
All right, Mary Yerina, you know what? You're just cooking right now, and you picked up on this feminist thing, which I'd like to explain my point of view with you about that in our podcast Back Talk, which you have to go to WCBE, the podcast experience. And I think we have some good things to say if they want to hang around.
I think we do, and I hope they'll join us.